Okay, Lexington, it's time to talk. I'm Stephanie Theakston, Program Coordinator for Lexington's Domestic and Sexual Violence Prevention Coalition.
And I'm Diane Fleet, Assistant Director of Greenhouse 17 and Chair of the Prevention Coalition. Welcome to It's Time to Talk. We'll be talking to many community members to help us gain understanding and model conversations and actions to help us move forward so that you can say, it's time and I am ready to help. Welcome. My name is Diane Fleet, and I'm the Associate Director at Greenhouse 17, and we're so glad you're joining us with It's Time to Talk podcast. And today's conversation is one that I've been really excited about. I know Stephanie Theakston, who is beside me, has also been really intrigued with it. And I'll just to begin to say, as my work with working with survivors of intimate partner violence, one of the things that I often hear with folks that are living at our shelters services often talk about their faith both as a healing process, but sometimes talk about their faith that they didn't feel comfortable coming forward to talk about it with their clergy and with their member congregation because they didn't know if that would be a safe space. And so we're really excited to have folks here with us today that can kind of maybe lead that conversation, maybe encourage faith communities to be more aware, to know more about intimate partner violence, to do a little homework, and to figure out how we can stand up and show up for our families that might be experiencing violence in their home. And so Stephanie, what was it that you were kind of hoping to come from this conversation?
I was really hoping that we could have a conversation about how faith can heal, but also be used as a tool for further coercion, and the role that ministers, priests, reverends might have, because I think survivors often turn to people in these roles first before they seek help from social services. So today, to help us with this conversation, we have Father Jim Sichko, a priest in the Catholic Diocese of Lexington, and he has been commissioned by Pope Francis as a papal missionary of mercy. And we also have Reverend Canon Dr. Helen VanKoevering with the Episcopal Diocese of Lexington and rector of St. Raphael's Episcopal Church.
It's an exciting pair that we have here, and we're really hoping to have some enlightened conversation from you all and have some guidance in this. And I know right before we began and we sat at the video, I was talking with you, Reverend Helen, and you were saying one of the conversations that you've been having is about Green Dot and how to be aware of things that might not look safe, that you might be beginning to recognize signs of intimate partner violence. And you had also talked in the midst of COVID, right? So you were doing a lot of Zoom pastoral and sermons through Zoom, and you were beginning to see signs. And I think that's one of the first critical pieces is how do we even know what we're seeing? How do we begin to kind of make ourselves aware of relationships that might not be healthy? Because I think if we can't do that, then we really aren't even in a place to somewhat move forward. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about your experience with that.
I think that my desire to do the training with Green Dot was because in that first year of COVID, it wasn't so much that I saw people, whether on Zoom or in person, it was that everything had changed and I wasn't seeing anybody. And I did already know something about the background of some of the people that are usually in front of me, and I wasn't hearing anything. So it changed everything. And I think it's continued, what we went through has continued to change how the faith community can act together and be together and what our leadership is about, really. I think we've got an opportunity, to be honest, to do something different, to move into different spaces. The Green Dot training helped me actually feel, oh, okay, I can recognize things, I can pick up on things, and not just in my own congregation, but their training was about if you're just in the street or you see something happen, you can understand, you can think about what it is that you can do to lessen whatever is going on, divert their attention or whatever. But I do think we're in a time now when we can start thinking about what the faith communities can do going forward, as much as, including whatever we did before, but going forward.
I love that you said that, and I think, again, that's such a foundation of its time, is that this is everybody's issue. Everybody can do something.
Yeah.
And so I love that you somewhat mirrored that. And I also think from Stephanie and I's perspective as to why we really wanted to have this conversation also is, we sort of represent the formal response, right? So we work with a coalition of shelter providers, nonprofit advocacy, criminal justice. But so many people in Kentucky and in Lexington don't access services and support through the formal programs, but they might go to friends, family, and their faith community. So, Father Jim, I don't know what your experience might be as to in your own work, in your own discipleship.
Sure. So one of the things that has always amazed me, let's see, I've been ordained now for 25 years. I'm 56 years old. And it's pretty sad to say this, but I have never heard a sermon from the pulpit on domestic violence, ever.
I was worried you might say that.
But, I think, first of all, we have to recognize and we have to be bold enough to say emphatically that domestic violence is a sin, regardless of the situation. That this is not approved, it is wrong, and it is not something that God is part of. But I think also we have to have and use the intuitive gifts that God gives us each to be able to trust our instincts and be able to recognize when we see things that just aren't right. And to be able to call on that and check that out in very pastoral, very sensitive, and very confidential ways. As one who travels throughout the world and not having an individual parish, it's a little bit difficult because I don't see the same people every day. Okay? But in the same aspect, it's very freeing for the other because they know I don't know them or their family or their status. And the church provides, at least the Catholic Church, the church provides an opportunity where people can come and be totally anonymous and share their situations on both ends and be able to be given guidance and direction. I think, though, that for me, it's time as a preacher, but also as a Catholic Christian, as a member of faith, that my brothers and sisters step up and be bold enough to call it out, to preach it, and to begin to stop it.
So, Father Jim, I'm so glad that you mentioned that you have not heard, I'm very sad that you have not heard sermons about domestic violence, but I'm glad that you brought it up, because one of the things that Diane and I continually try to tell people is that we're not asking you to add something else to your daily routine. We're not asking you to take on a big volunteer project. We're asking you to look at the roles that you're currently in and how you can think about that differently in order to help prevent domestic violence. And so for people that speak in front of congregations, speaking about domestic violence is just not asking you to do anything differently, but to really make a difference. And so if you could talk about, both of you, why that is so important, how that might transform the church, what that might sound like, that would be great.
Well, definitely, first and foremost, it goes hand in hand with Scripture. The first commandment for us is a very powerful one, and people take it so lightly. It is to love God with all your heart, mind, and soul, your entire being, and love your neighbor as yourself. So with that, there is a great introduction into what it means, which is respecting, which is respecting God, respecting creation, and respecting one another, you know.
Respecting also, so I've spent a lot of my life living in a Portuguese-speaking country, Mozambique. So when I hear words and to pull it apart is just interesting to me. Respecting means to re-see, re-look at something. Now you might think you know somebody like I do in my congregation, but seeing something visible and do you understand this situation? I have heard actually a very large Bible study with bishops at Lambeth Conference back 10 years ago or so, where they actually looked at the passage about Tamar, who was raped by her brother, the son of King David. And the way it was led through left us all feeling in the end, well, who was the culpable person in the end? It was all of them. It was the maids that didn't do anything about it. It was the king that did nothing about it. And that is possibly how we can reread some passages that we know in the Bible or in our faith communities, because we all have a catechism and we all have statements of belief and things like that, to reread that with the understanding that this is going on and that the inequalities between the way men and women are being treated in the world and how we treat one another and all the rest, we're all part of this. We can't just turn a blind eye to it because it's not happening in my life, but it's happening in others, and not even just in the people in front of me in a church, but it's happening out there. And what can we do about that? It's opening our eyes. And I do think our faith and even rereading the Bible can open that up in some places. I for myself, I feel like we need a re-education, and I think clergy possibly need a re-education sometimes too. You know, when we have our retreats and that, perhaps we could actually look at these sorts of subjects and not pretend they're not there, but that our faith can actually respond to these situations. And as we were saying before, they're very intersectional as well. So you might think you're looking at one sort of subject or a social issue today, but there's possibly a lot of things going on. I am particularly strong at trying to make connections with the organizations that can deal with this, because I am not the expert. I can try and see it and I can try and connect people in, and I think that is my role. I think I was even told several years ago that it's not for us to try and be everything in it. And actually, even when I'm doing marriage counsel before a wedding, you know, I'll say to people, if there's a real issue, then I can refer you, because that's not really my role I can't do that for 250 people.
And I think that's so important. That's something that we also talk about often, is that I think sometimes people are afraid to even bring it up, because then they don't know how to respond. But no one is asking you to be experts in this, but to make those referrals is so important.
But I think that one of the things is, and building upon, is, you know, God provides each of us with an intuition, a conscience. Unless we have watered that down so drastically, we need to begin to listen to that conscience and not turn a blind eye, so that when I run into someone or I bypass someone or I see someone and there is something that is triggering something, doesn't mean that I have to be the expert, but what it does mean is that I follow up on that and either find someone who can intervene, or, you know, intervene yourself, or seek out the agencies. I think what happens is oftentimes we get this feeling, and then in turn we, oh no, that can't be right, or that can't be happening, and what I call it the voice of God. And I really do share with people, do you know what the voice of God sounds like in your life? In your life, it's different than in my life. Because why? We're all different, praise God. We're all different, okay? But I think the thing is, one way in which we can be similar and creative is by getting the message out. You know, the statistics and sharing, 15, 16 people have lost their lives in just a year alone. That's unacceptable. You know, and we need to have people preaching the truth, and the truth sometimes is very difficult to hear and uncomfortable. But through that uncomfortableness, growth and resurrection can arise.
One thing, so many things have popped up that you all have talked about, and so I don't want to be scattered with it. But one of the things that you just said actually a second ago is that we need to talk about it. We need to trust our intuition, and we need to hear that voice of God in our conversation when we're working in faith communities. And so, but if we don't do that, if we don't have the communication, we don't have the conversation, we don't have the sermons, then it's a really easy space for people that are perpetrating abuse on families to fill that space. And I think it's one of the things that we witness a great deal is that perpetrators of abuse have an amazing ability to take the facts and sort of turn them upside down to make it normal of the violence in the home. And so if the messaging from our faith communities and from our nonprofits and our medical communities and our community leaders are saying this is what this looks like, this is hurtful, this is not to be tolerant, we're not going to tolerate this. Our podcast that we had first was talking about accountability, but also when someone in your life is someone that you love is perpetrating domestic violence. And so my next little segue in that is I think it's a difficult place for faith communities to deal with it because you often have the whole family in the church. And so it's not just when the luxury, I guess, of Greenhouse 17 that I have the victim comes forward and I can wrap around he or she, but you all have the community of it. And so being able to respond with love to both, but yet recognizing the harm and the violence that's occurring and upholding her, I'm going to say her, sorry, but he or she, whoever's experiencing the abuse, holding up her safety, her confidentiality, the ability to safety plan around that individual. But yet I think it can be difficult for faith communities because you also might have the person who's causing harm.
Yeah, and I think we have to be very careful on the pointing of the finger, especially in today's society with same-sex attractions and various things, that it's not always a him and a her, and we have to be able to recognize that we're all God's children. Pope Francis makes it very clear, and as God does, that we are all God's children, and that we all deserve justice and respect and renewal, okay? But at the same time, I think one of the things that is very difficult is, so I come from a tradition that had a very horrid background with covering up abuse, as many traditions have. So oftentimes, we don't want to hear that from individuals of an institution, and so sometimes it's finding the appropriate path. It's, for some it may not be standing at a pulpit and preaching, but offering classes or offering outlets or a special little blurb in a bulletin or creative ways of letting just people know that there is an avenue, a safe spot where one can go, a respite.
Right. Right. I was speaking with someone in another faith community the other day, and they were saying all are welcome. But I thought, well, how would people all know, right? Like how do we message that? How do we talk about it?
And are people all welcome? I think the thing is, you can preach the message all you want. You can live the message all you want. But if you're not going to love the message, it shows. It shows. Even if a preacher gets up in front of the pulpit, well, even husbands and wives and families, it shows. So you have to believe in this. You have to recognize that this is an issue. It is wrong. It is sinful. It is, wrong. And this is what has to be done.
And how do we live that authentically? Yeah.
It is about authenticity, isn't it? It's about not blurring our message as well, because I understand our message to be what we're talking about, but that everybody's created in the image of God as well. Sure, it might be broken for whatever reasons, anything that's happened in their life, but everyone is created in the image of God, and not blurring, and that we're called to love our neighbours. All those basic messages that are the Christian faith, which is what we're talking about, then don't blur it by avoiding certain things, avoiding certain subjects. And the belief, I was also thinking, as one of you said, is to believe in what you're told from someone as well. And of course, I don't know all the details. They're telling me things that I must just believe, but and then connect with others, but it's that believing, and then I think holding that that people can trust who you are because they've known who you are. I think that's why they come to you. They know what you stand for. They know that you live it out and you're authentic, and they'll come to that. And I've spoken to different people in different places, and silence is actually what a lot of people are actually yearning for. They want to be able to tell it all. They want to actually say it all, and you're not going to react and throw them out, but you're going to listen. And I remember listening to a man actually years ago who he talked for like half an hour, and at the end he thanked me for resolving his whatever. And it's like, I didn't say a thing. It's just being there and creating that space. And I think it's risky for us as well, because I get involved, I listen, and I'm what can I do to support? Or it's a risky place to be.
Lexington is a very diverse community with a very diverse ethnicity. And I think that also is something that really has to be looked at, because sadly, some ethnic backgrounds, this is part of,
You're correct, and I was going to bring that up because marriage as an institution is very religious. And so for some, I would feel very comfortable if someone is experiencing domestic violence and goes to either of you. But if someone is married and experiencing domestic violence in that marriage, has been married in the church, I think that it is perhaps some ministers' intuition is to let's mediate that marriage, or so it's not just the ethnic culture, but even the culture of the church, where the idea is that this is okay, that we can counsel you through this. So what would you say about that?
The first and foremost is to recognize, I do exactly what my colleague here says. I am not a counselor. I am not a trained psychologist. I'm not even a doctor, okay? But I am someone that is willing to pick up the phone. I am someone who's willing to walk with you. I am willing to give you my number. I am willing to provide you the necessary. And there has to come a time when I have to also be the one to say, this has to stop. Period. Period. And if you never talk to me again because of what I must do, then so be it.
I've noticed a real uptick actually recently at shelter of churches, faith communities, pastors bringing someone out to Greenhouse 17, which, you know, one, it makes me, I don't know if happy's the right word, but I love the relationship. And you were talking about being able to make the referral. This is what I can do. I recognize this, but now I have partnerships in the community that might be able to help. And so that type of referral, I think, is fabulous, because it then can be kind of a joined support. I can reach out to my faith community for my healing process, but I can reach out to Greenhouse 17 both for healing and for safety. So that piece, I think, is really good. And it reminds me, talking a little bit with you all also about medical community. One thing we've really pushed a great deal is for, you know, doctors, nurses, emergency rooms to begin to ask those questions. They don't always ask it well, but even just are you doing okay? Do you feel safe in your home? Or is anybody hurting you in your home? I don't have to have all the answers, but I have the connection now. So I think for faith communities to begin thinking about that, of I don't have to fix it all, but I'm aware of it. This is an issue that concerns me because it concerns my community. And I have relationships with people to connect with folks, I think, is really important. I do think we shy away from it, right? Like, ooh, that's an inconvenient truth. I didn't want,
Right.
I didn't want that to be said.
And I think it shows up, to be honest with you, in the most disguising ways. You know, being on an airplane and someone sits next to you and kind of just writes a little message on a napkin. Or someone goes to the bathroom and they turn to you and say, I need help. What do? You know,
right.
You have to respond. You know,
You do.
and I think the thing is that it takes, being a Christian means you're going to have to risk. You're going to have to get out of, you know, we see enough, I hate to say it, we see enough in the Bible of people who don't get out of the boat, who stay in their comfort zones. I think we're called to actually get out of the boat, walk on water, and if we sink, we sink. But we have God, we have Jesus, who is going to move us and heal us, regardless of what we may be facing or understanding.
Reverend Helen, you earlier mentioned about the inequalities, and as Diane was saying, some people that perpetuate domestic violence are very good at using religion to further those inequalities. But I know that you've done a lot of work with women. So can you just talk about the ways in which the church has an obligation, if you feel that way, to lift up women and children, and rather than that traditional role that I heard growing up, at least the stories that are told through church of women being a little less than men?
I've been thinking about this more recently, and I like it if I can reframe things, you know. So tradition is something that we're facing with violence, isn't it? Tradition. This is how you treat your wife or your spouse, or this is how you treat the children. This is what you do, you know. And I wonder if we're not covering up some things, because when I hear this, it's often from people that actually haven't been raised in the church. They're just assuming some things. And then also, if that is the case with the teaching that they've received, I've kind of coined a phrase that we need to change the air that we breathe about it. And I feel strongly about that in my church. So if I can put information out there for people who are passing through about who they can contact, if I can be someone that can ask the right question, or people feel free to say it. Maybe it's something to do with my size or just being female. I don't know what it is, but people, if you can look people in the eyes and have those that insight, that intuition that you say, and work with that. And also educate yourself about all these things. You know, educate. There are different places you can go that you can actually receive some teaching on this. My daughter, who's a social worker, tells me there's a course called NAMI, N-A-M-I, that she took at the beginning of her training. She's recommended that leaders do it, you know, and it's 8 hours, and you commit yourself to learning about how to deal with such situations in the role that you have in that situation. Not in every role. I'm not you. I'm not in your positions, you know. But to not know is not okay anymore. We've got to face that we don't know, and don't know it in different cultures as well. It's very different to where I was before to being here. People will talk here if they trust you. If they trust you, and they'll talk and talk and talk. And but how can you work with that? How can you help move through that? You know, help them move through that in some way. And sometimes it's by silence. I repeat. I just think we don't know everything. So in another culture, you wouldn't even dream of talking about such issues, and you've got to find another way round. So I had a thing where my husband would be visiting a community, and he would say, I always knew about what was going on before he did, because I'd go where the women were, and they'd be around the pot making the food or something, and they're just talking, because it is being talked about, but there's not an outlet, you know. So it's kind of offering yourself to be that outlet as well, I suppose. It's quite complicated, but I think if you're willing to understand that this is happening, if you're even open to that it's not all wonderful and glorious out there, and there are people in your church community that are struggling, you know, and it's not to judge, it's just what's going on.
I think that is such the, you know, wish of this podcast series is taking what you just said, and we're learning from that, is to insert our own selves into spaces that we often were not, and reaching out a hand to folks and saying, you know, we want you to be part of this conversation. We want, you know, faith communities. We're going to do one later on workplace communities, you know, how we all, you know, show up, how we can be part of the solution, and how with our expertise, with the Prevention Coalition, you know, with the Mayor's Office lending to this, and with nonprofits such as my own, you know, have we been a little remiss of keeping that information to ourselves? So how can we be better partners and friends to the community? And so I love that you said that. I think so much of this podcast is, I hope faith communities and faith leaders are people that are just informally associated with. How can we show up every day with a little more information and a little more challenge to ourselves that we need to know more, right? This is something that is happening. 1 in 3, 1 in 4 people, right, you know, are experiencing.
I think it's a grave injustice of faith communities and of, I will say it again, of fellow colleagues to not address this issue. It's a grave injustice. It's a sin, in fact, to not be able to name it, to claim it, and to hopefully tame it.
Yeah, I agree. It's the world as it is, but it's always been. But we are opening, but to actually name it and say, and look at what we can do to change that. I think it's our faithful duty to do that. It's what we should be doing.
I think it's beautiful, and I think that might be a perfect ending. Stephanie, I don't know if you have anything else to add to that, but that was sort of a lovely, I might just have that go out, the two of you at the very end of what you all just said, and to echo that. So thank you all so much for this conversation. It was really helpful. I hope it's supportive of its time in our community.
Yeah, I just thank you for your wisdom and your compassion and your willingness to be here. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a pleasure.
Thank you all so much for tuning in for the It's Time to Talk podcast series. You've been joining us to talk about faith communities today, and we appreciate you listening in.